Hey, gang. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Discourse Lab. I hope you're all doing well. Today's guest is Alex DeVitry. Now, I'm sure none of you know who Alex is because he's not exactly a public figure yet, but I really think that is going to change in the future because he is an exceedingly bright guy with just the most interesting backstory. And a result of that interesting backstory, he has a very well-informed and interesting and unique take on some very important subjects, issues, topics of our time, namely Islam, the Middle East, religion, the West, and political violence. To give a very brief summary, and we will get into this much more deeply in the episode, Alex is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white guy who grew up in a fundamentalist sect of Islam here in the United States, eventually made it to Saudi Arabia to study Arabic language and Islamic theology, and is now studying all sorts of interesting things at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs, aka SIPA. To be more specific, Alex is a part of the International Security Policy Program at SIPA, where he is triple focusing in international conflict resolution, foreign policy and diplomacy, and the Middle East. It also bears mentioning that Alex writes a really good Substack, which we talk about in the episode, that not a lot of people follow yet, so I'm going to encourage you all to go ahead and follow him. The link's going to be in the episode description, like it always is. I cannot recommend it highly enough. He's got some good stuff in the works over there. If Alex and I seem kind of chummy, it's because we were at Columbia at the same time and we had a couple classes together. So, yeah, it pays to have really smart and insightful friends when you have a podcast. And lastly, I'm sure you will all notice that Anthony is absent from this episode. Don't worry, we didn't break up. We decided that it might be fun for each of us to try doing episodes on our own every now and again. It allows each of us to take a break every so often and also practice our interviewing skills solo. So you can also look forward to some Anthony-only episodes. You will get a break from me. Don't worry. All right, with all that said, I bring you Alex DeVitry.
This is Discourse Lab.
MAGA in Trump 2.0 is a cultural phenomenon.
I'm Anthony Rispo.
And I am Clayton Smith.
Is this the moment where I let you know that I think your therapist is incompetent or inadequate for you?
On this podcast, you'll hear a wide range of perspectives from an ideologically diverse suite of guests.
Social psychologists will just seamlessly import leftist ideology.
It's quite a radical idea, actually, to say that we're going to deregulate banking and take government out of all of these spheres of life in which it was previously involved.
Our goal? To use conversation to analyze ideas, test arguments, and question dogmas.
Terrorist speech, extremist speech, disinformation, misinformation, all of these concepts are inherently irreducibly subjective.
Now, let's head into the lab. Thanks for joining me, Alex. I really appreciate it. It's good to see you again, man.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. It's good to see you.
I kind of want to just jump into it here with you because I will have teased this in the intro, but you have a fascinating backstory. So I want to go way farther back than Columbia, right? Let me just ask you, where do you come from and what is your origin story in your own words?
Yeah, I am born in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, which anyone from the region will know is Amish country, if you're familiar with the Amish. I come from a family that is half Old Order Mennonite, which are the people that you imagine when you think of the Amish, horse and buggy, barn raising, that sort of thing. And then the other half are Muslim. So I was raised as a Salafist Wahhabi Muslim, which is a fundamentalist group. Moved around a lot, lived in Ohio a little bit, spent a lot of time in New Jersey, spent about a decade and a half down south in Georgia. So when people ask me casually where I'm from, I tell them I'm from Georgia, because that's where I really put roots down. And then somewhere in there, I spent some time in the Middle East, living mostly based in Saudi Arabia, but moved around a little bit. Studying Arabic language and Islamic theology. So I have a degree in Arabic language from that university there, but it was unaccredited. So when I got back to the States, I had no college education.
At least not on paper, obviously.
Right.
But you
Right.
did, but you didn't officially, in a sense. Wow. So you said some things I'm sure are gonna make some people's ears perk up. Like, well, hold on. We're living in Georgia. If people are watching this, you're like, this guy looks like a guy from Georgia with the blonde beard and
Yep.
the pale skin. If you don't mind me saying, I'm also equally pale, so I can say that.
Yeah.
Um, and then you kind of throw this thing out like, oh, I studied Arabic language in Saudi Arabia and lived there for years, and it's like, whoa. How did a guy from Amish country who put down roots in Georgia end up in Saudi Arabia? So give us that story, because it's fascinating.
Yeah. So the short version is that my mom, when I was 1.5 or 2 years old, married a Moroccan immigrant. She converted to Islam, married a Moroccan immigrant, and so I was raised by this Moroccan man. He ends up joining this fundamentalist sect of Muslims that was big among Black Americans on the East Coast in the 90s. And that's a whole separate sociological, political conversation, which is fascinating in its own right. So he joins this group. That sect is sponsored by the government of Saudi Arabia. And that's a little window into a whole political dynamic that was happening in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, where Middle Eastern governments were sponsoring and funding religious movements in Europe and the West and the United States. So Muammar Gaddafi of Libya was very big into this. He built a lot of mosques in Canada, for instance. And Saudi Arabia was a sponsor for a lot of fundamentalist movements here in America and in Europe. So I grew up in that environment. When I was 16, I got a scholarship to go to a theological seminary in Saudi Arabia. So I went over there, and just by pure coincidence, I happened to land there right before the Arab Spring popped off. Right before that citrus merchant set himself on fire in Tunisia.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I got there. And then the story of my being there is one where I'm kind of coming of age in this era of political upheaval and political violence, such that kids around me, people who were my friends, 16, 17, 18, 19 years old, were jumping on these big Mercedes flatbed trucks with loudspeakers that would roll through the city, calling people to go fight the Shaitan Bashar al-Assad in Syria, or to go fight the Houthis in Yemen. This was right before the civil war in Yemen really exploded. Tensions were brewing between the Houthis and a Sunni tribe called the Hajuris that administered a semi-autonomous state in which an important madrasa that we were associated with sat. So that's kind of the environment that I matured in. I came of age in.
Yeah, how if you don't mind me asking, actually two important questions. First of all,
Sure.
what was the name of that sect so that our listeners can kind of look it up and look more into it? We probably can't get into it in the conversation for sake of time.
You can if you Google the Madkhalis, Madkhali, that's what they're called by outsiders. It's a Salafist sect. So if you just look up Salafism, you'll find that Salafism is divided into two big categories: the quietists and the jihadists. Quietists are people who are fundamentalists in their personal lives, but are anti-political. So they do not engage in the movements of political Islam that we typically associate with Muslim fundamentalists. So that's kind of that's the sect. There's a wonderful recent book that just came out by an American scholar named Yasser Qadhi. It's called Understanding Salafism. Amazing book. Yasser is a practicing Muslim, so he has theological commitments, but he's also an excellent scholar. So I highly recommend this book to any listeners who are interested in religious studies and interested in understanding fundamentalist Islam.
We'll definitely link that in the show notes below so everyone can
Awesome.
check it out. And the other question I wanted to ask is, you're talking about coming of age in this environment. So actually, how old were you? Was it right around normal college age?
So I went there when I was 16, and I stayed.
Wow.
I came back just before I turned 20.
Interesting. So but you were studying sort of at, even though it wasn't accredited, like you said, at a collegiate level, more or less.
Yes. Yeah. I
from a relatively young age.
Yes. So one thing that's important for my background is that I never had a standard K through 12 education. I was I was homeschooled, theoretically homeschooled anyway. Pennsylvania has a lot of really lenient education policies because of the Amish community.
Mm.
Pennsylvania is very protective over the Amish. So they have a lot of very lenient policies, and my parents took advantage of that. And the practical result was that I had little to no education. I had to teach myself out of a GED book, basic algebra, and
Wow.
enough science to pass the state GED exam. So I got my GED when I was 15, and then the next year I went over to Saudi Arabia to enroll in a college level program. Funny thing, the college I was in was accredited the year after I left. So if I had just waited, I would have had a bachelor's degree when I got back.
Oh, that's feels like you got screwed a little bit on that one.
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit, yeah. But that's okay, because you ended up in a good place. We'll get more into that in a second. But so that's about 3 or 4 years is roughly in there, like
roughly 3.5. Yeah,
3.5 years.
2009 to early 2012.
And so these are obviously formative years. You're raised Muslim, and I'm wondering, to what degree did you buy into it as a young man? Just for context, to kind of give you a sense of the kind of thing I'm asking. Like, I was raised Protestant Christian, pretty, like non-denominational, standard American. Like, if you would ask me what I was when I was 14, I would have been like, I'm just Christian. I'm Protestant Christian.
Yeah.
I'm probably a little, just funnily enough, because this is just so me. Even as a kid, I was a sort of a know-it-all nerd, and people would say, well, I'm Catholic, and I would say I'm Christian. They go, well, I'm Catholic, and I'd be like, that's Christian, dummy.
That's still Christian.
That's still Christian, and kids like wouldn't know the difference, and I'd be like, no, there's Protestantism and there's Catholicism, and you have Eastern Orthodox. So I was annoying even from a young age, but so the reason I'm bringing this up, right, is because I was like a non-denominational Christian. I believed it pretty strongly. I think I really bought into it until I was about 15, and really in the course of maybe 6 months to a year, and somewhere in that time frame, started to have doubts. And then eventually I remember walking out of church one day and just being like, no, I don't believe this anymore. And I remember it being like a weight lifted off my shoulders. Like, I had this sort of internal tension of like, I want to believe it, I kind of believe it, I have this emotional attachment to it, but there's all these things going off in the reason centers of my brain. And I was, of course, being influenced at the time in the perfect time zone, right, to be influenced by the new atheist movement. So like Dawkins and Harris, and I still like Sam Harris, and actually still like a lot of them, but Hitchens especially, like watching the YouTube videos, and just couldn't get away from it, and decided, you know what, I don't believe in this anymore. And so I'm wondering if you believed in it as a young kid, are you still Muslim? How do you feel about that? Did you have a similar kind of like, I'm going to come away from it, or do you believe in it even more now? I really don't have any idea where you're at right now.
Yeah. So, I have a story of similar beats, but almost an opposite emotional trajectory.
Interesting.
I'm a full send kind of guy. So, I was like wholly into it during my early teen years. But I have always had this drive to ask a lot of questions, to seek truth. When I was 9, this is a formative experience that I remember very clearly. I was standing, looking outside of the window. We were not allowed to go out and intermix with the infidels in the country that we lived in, which is an important thing to talk about later when we start talking about what I'm working on now. I remember looking out and watching kids my age playing in the street, and I turned and I asked my mom, how do we know that we're right and they're wrong? Because that was a big thing. Like, these people are all spiritually impure. They're going to hell. And that's why we don't interact with them, because we are the chosen people, the pure people, it's typical cult stuff. And I asked her that question, how do we know that we're right and they're wrong? And her response was rage. She threatened me, do you want to go to hell? You don't ask questions like that. What do you think you're doing? I guess I had enough emotional awareness at the time to realize that she was terrified. And she was
Mm.
terrified because the answer to her question, the true answer to her question was, I don't know.
Hmm.
And so from that moment, I kind of developed this complex about intellectual honesty and trying to find truth, even if the truth kind of sucks, right? And that is my entire project carrying through this political violence work that I'm doing at Columbia and
Mm.
and onwards. Um, and at the same time, that was in tension with the part of me that wholly believed this, or at least wanted to wholly believe this. And so, one story about the motivation I had for going to Saudi Arabia in the first place would be to say that I knew that my parents didn't have the answers I was looking for, but maybe those who understood the religion better did.
Right.
Maybe I could go over there and enroll in a theological seminary and study with the most reputable religious leaders of our time in within my subsect. Um, and I would find the answers there. And the experience I had over that 3 years was that they don't know what they're talking about either, right? Um,
So this is interesting, just to kind of put a pin on it, or to kind of emphasize it a little bit. You went there with a lot of doubts, but you went there in a sense to assuage those doubts, right? You were looking for the answers and you thought, well, I can believe in this if a smart enough, educated enough person can explain to me these questions that my parents can't. These give me the
yes.
answers my parents can't.
That is one version of my motivations to go there. Humans are multifaceted,
Of
complex
course.
beings,
Yeah.
right? With there are many different stories that you could tell about why I did that, and they're all true. Um, and that's one big one.
Hmm. And what did you mind if I ask? Let's take a small detour here. What's it like being a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white guy in Saudi Arabia? Were you like the only one?
Um, yeah, pretty much. There were two more. Two more. One had been there for almost 2 decades at that point. His name was Musa Richardson. He's since come back, and he is the leader of a relatively decent sized mosque in Pittsburgh.
Interesting.
Um, Still wholly, fundamentalist Muslim. I haven't talked to him in a while, but he was a very good friend of mine when I was there. And then most other Americans that were there were Black Muslims, either who had come out of the Nation of Islam movement, which was dying at that point in the
Hmm.
90s, and a lot of people were looking for other places to go, and some of them landed in the Salafist sect. But yeah, I was pretty much the only blonde white guy. And what I found at that time, this is going to be a cultural generalization, and it's also one that is changing now with the social media age. What I found was that the Saudis were really good at being pro-white racists, right? They really went out of their way to kind of elevate me and to make my life easy. You know, I had the blue passport and white skin, and that made life really easy for me compared to my colleagues. And so what I would end up
Interesting.
doing is advocating for other Americans who are not white with the administration of the university or with representatives of the government, because we found that that made them a lot more willing to listen to whatever it is that we were presenting.
So this is fascinating to me, and I think this is something that is actually becoming more widely understood now. I think for a long time it wasn't, which is that racism is a problem among Arab populations because, believe it or not, they also had I should say specifically anti-black racism, because
Yes.
they had a slave trade, an African slave trade that was far more long-running than the
Yes.
transatlantic slave trade.
Yes.
And I've heard this. I want to check my math with you on this. I've heard that the word in Arabic, at least in some dialects, for an African or a dark-skinned person is related to the word for slave. Is that correct, or is that something wrong I've seen online?
That doesn't ring with the Arabic that I know, but I'm not
It could.
familiar with all dialects. Yeah.
Interesting.
No, to call somebody black in Arabic, you describe them as Sud, which is the root word for the country name Sudan. Literally
Interesting.
is the plural form of black person. So the
Right.
land of the black people is Sudan. And then the word for slave is Abd. They're etymologically completely
Mm.
separate. Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, so maybe because that's why I wanted to check myself because I was like, I heard this online. It could easily be
Yeah.
wrong.
I mean, it could
Um,
be in some regional dialects. I
Right.
don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the other thing I'm thinking of so that kind of explains, I think, to a degree why you had some of that anti-black racism. But I'm also thinking about you as a white guy. I have to imagine that like part of their motivation was the fact that Saudi Arabia and America have a relationship. And then part of their motivation maybe is that, hey, if we can get more blonde hair, blue eyes white guys to convert to Islam and really espouse it and preach it, and maybe they will be better at converting other white guys.
Yes.
Right. So is that
Yeah.
kind of the logic?
Yeah, that was explicitly part of the logic. Yes. And in fact, that's why the program was set up in the first place, to try and get Westerners to come over, learn, and then go back and preach.
Interesting. And so again, I want to go back to this. Where are you now with Islam? You said that your questions weren't answered. I know
Yeah.
this is a bit of a personal question. I'm sorry to ask, but
No, I'm happy to talk about it. Yeah.
are you like a devout Muslim? Do you have a different perspective on it? Have you left the religion?
Yeah. So I had to go through this process of leaving and returning to actually allow my relationship with faith to mature. And what I'm about to say will probably piss off a lot of different people, both religious and atheists, for different reasons. But what I've landed on, and this coincidentally is one of the things on which I vehemently disagree with Sam Harris, even though I have a lot of respect for him as an intellectual, as one of the few online presences from the New Atheist movement that has maintained their intellectual honesty. Um, Religion is a cultural identifier before it is a doctrine of beliefs.
Okay.
Religion does contain doctrines of beliefs, but it also carries with it a cultural psychology and an association with peoplehood that is prior. So someone can fully abandon the doctrine of beliefs of Islam and still be psychologically and culturally a Muslim thinker.
Oh, I think that is very profound, and I've brought it up many times on this podcast before. I think about the same thing from the Christian perspective.
Absolutely.
Tom Holland's book is one I brought up many, many times, and I think he hits. Actually, we'll tell an anecdote really quickly. I had a Muslim professor at Columbia who taught Islam, like a class on Islam, kind of an intro to Islam, basically.
Was it Wal Halak?
No, it was. Oh, I'm totally forgetting his name in the moment. I should know it, and it'll come to me maybe
Yeah, no
later.
worries. Yeah.
But I'm sure I'll tell you. I'll text it to you. You'd probably be familiar with him. He gave me this same logic independently. So I read this book by Tom Holland, and then I was talking to him about a similar thing, and he came up with the same idea, which is in the West and in the U.S., we are a Christian nation in the sense that our culture and our institutions are greatly affected by ideas that have their origins in Christian theology and philosophy.
Yes.
I want to be clear that I'm not saying that everyone should be Christian or that it should be a national religion. I'm saying in a philosophical sense, in a cultural sense, we are a Christian nation in terms of our origins, right? Our ideological and philosophical and cultural origins. And I think that is very true what you're saying of Islam. And I think we'll get into this later, but I think that idea that you're outlining, that it is a peoplehood cultural identifier, I think that plays a lot into what's going on in Iran right now. And we'll get into that. I think that is, and specifically the fact that Iran maintained a Persian identity
Absolutely
underneath, sort of under that layer of Islamic identity that was on top for so long. But we'll get into that very soon. So, but I want to continue with your view on faith. So continue on. I also want to say very briefly, I want to talk about Sam Harris just a little bit and say, I think one of the best things that he does, one of the ways he has been most correct and vindicated is his insistence that people do need some kind of spirituality. Most people do. And I actually buy in to the Harris version of spirituality, I think, more than I don't. In terms of, I meditate, I go backpacking specifically to have a spiritual experience, among other things. So I think that is worth noting. I think he got that right where other new atheists got it wrong.
I think I agree with you. Yeah, in large part. Yeah, he talks about what he calls the moral landscape.
Yes, great book. We'll put that in the show notes too.
The moral landscape. I have some philosophical disagreements with it, but he's leaning into a deep tradition of value pluralism to which I ascribe, and I encourage any listeners to look into. Thoughts that emerged from classic liberal thinkers like Isaiah Berlin, for instance, brilliant political philosopher who should be read. So yeah, I have a lot of respect for Sam Harris. The other thing that I really value about him is his resistance to algorithmic capture.
Yes.
Algorithmic capture is something that I find is one of the most impactful political and sociological forces in our age. And we can see the degradation that it has on public intellectuals. I don't want to name names for fear of alienating listeners, but we can see when someone begins an online presence with a genuinely valid intellectual view of the world, and they're slowly pulled into these pipelines because algorithmic engagement rewards certain ideas and punishes others.
There's
And Sam Harris is deeply resistant to that. So I have a lot of respect for him.
Yeah, he did something right, and I want to move on from him because I don't want to do too much Sam Harris talk, but I think it is worth noting what he did right because this applies more broadly, which is, A, he built a strong financial base for himself of listeners who value his open-mindedness and his content and can disagree with him and won't punish him for it, right? Yes. Broadly speaking, which I think is important because financial incentives play a huge role in what people do online. And also he got off of social media, huge one there, right? And so I think those two things, and he makes a conscious effort that is part of a conscious effort to clarify his thinking. And I also think just meditating and being mindful of oneself and how you think and how you feel is extremely important. He does that too.
Right.
So that's just broad advice.
Right.
I think he's a proof of concept for those things.
Yeah.
For anyone engaging online, I am trying to take inspiration from him, for example. And I think that the people you're talking about, which we won't name, they succumb to audience capture.
Yeah.
And that's the big thing.
Yes.
Which has within it, things around ego and things around financial incentives and so on and so forth. And he managed to dodge that very intentionally.
Yeah. Yeah.
And no matter what you think of his beliefs, I think a lot of people would disagree with him very strongly.
Which I do.
Which you do. I'm sure you agree with him very strongly on some things and then very strongly disagree with him on others.
Yes.
But you have to admire that. And I think he is a brilliant example. Even if you think he gets things very wrong, he does so honestly, right?
Yes. And to pull this back to where we started with this, which is my relationship with Islam.
Please.
Where I'm at with it is that I value this spirituality. And I had to mature into valuing spirituality intellectually and emotionally, and then finding that spirituality in some version of Islam that I felt I could honestly commit to. That's an ongoing project. Part of the big challenge is finding a community that will accommodate this, and I haven't found that yet. But I'm trending more in that direction than I am to, a deconstructed new atheist sort of thing.
Have you thought about bringing Jesus into your life, Alex? Accepting the Lord's love? Come on.
If only you knew how many people have made that pitch to me. No, to be honest with you, if commitment to religious doctrine was something I could wholly just ignore, the Catholic tradition attracts me.
Yeah.
Because of its philosophical heritage. I think it has a beautiful philosophical heritage.
And the cathedrals,
just cannot commit to the doctrinal beliefs of the Trinity and all that. I just can't do that. Right. And so I'm trying to find a similar relationship that respects my cultural heritage and my cultural psychology as an American Muslim. Which is this complicated thing that is greater than the sum of its parts. Yeah.
Very, very interesting. I think I'm actually curious. I don't know enough about Islam or Christianity. I know a lot more about Christianity to say this with confidence, but I have an inkling and I want to test it against your knowledge, which is, I think, an advantage that it's one thing I will actually say Muslims, I think, criticize Christianity for this from a theological perspective, but I think it is an advantage of Christianity in terms of adaptability is that technically the Quran is the literal word of God, right? It was handed down from an archangel, translated from God to the angel to Muhammad. It's bulletproof. It's supposed to be.
Yes.
Christianity is a set of texts that have been kind of edited and decided upon and accepted and rejected over many centuries and debated and interpreted. And so it's very sort of chaotic nature. It's diffuse nature. It's the fact that they are writings allegedly or supposedly of people who are witnesses to Christ and not like the literal word of God per se, gives it this, and I'm sure the many hypocrisies you can find in the text there within actually make it super adaptable to modernity in a way that a religion like Islam maybe would struggle with a lot more.
Yes. Yes, you're absolutely right. And this presents two unique challenges and an opportunity to the Muslim intellectual. The first unique challenge is that it's incompatible with material history. We can go back and find other versions of the Quran that faithful Muslims will, or I should say, rather than faithful Muslims, I should say Muslim apologists will attempt to explain away by arguing for linguistic complexities. And there's supposedly 7 readings of the Quran that adapt to linguistic complexity and things like that. It's an empty justification. Because if there are different authentic versions of the Quran that were related from different witnesses to the preachings of Muhammad, for whom belief in their honesty and integrity is an equally important theological commitment to the Muslim apologist, then you have something that's incompatible, right? And this presents an intellectual challenge that has to be overcome if you're going to remain fully committed to orthodoxy. The opportunity that it presents is because it is defined and rigid and cannot be changed. The intellectual creativity that generates when trying to make it mesh with other cultural commitments that people have, like the Platonic traditions that come into Islam during the early Abbasid period, generates a uniquely Muslim philosophical tradition, which then proceeds to compete against more fundamentalist traditions throughout the history of Islam. And so there's some incredibly influential philosophical works and perspectives from early Muslim history that continue to impact us today and have even penetrated into the core of what we call the West, if we want to conceive of it as something that is separate from the Muslim world.
Something else we will get into, by the way.
Something else that we will get into. Yeah. So there's, it's just a wonderfully interesting intellectual journey going into the history of this religion. I'll recommend to listeners a YouTube channel by a professor from Notre Dame called Gabriel Said Reynolds. He runs a YouTube channel called the Exploring the Quran and the Bible. He's a religious scholar that specializes in New Testament studies and Quranic studies, and he's a wonderful resource for people who are interested in religious history.
Again, that will be linked. Everything mentioned in the episode will be linked in the show notes, so
Yeah.
you'll all be able to find that very quickly and easily. Okay, so your backstory, and there's even more. I don't want to spend too much time on it because there's other things we need to get to, but like you have a whole Amish aspect to your backstory too. That's really interesting.
That we just don't have time.
We don't have time for,
but it's really relevant. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you really good at woodworking? I have to ask.
I love it. Yeah, I love it. No, I'm really out of practice. I embarrassed myself recently when I went over to a friend's place last Halloween, and he wanted to build these. He wanted to turn this pile of scrap wood into some crosses that he was going to hang skeletons on for Halloween decorations, and I was like, yeah, I can strip these of bark and cut them down to points and stuff. And then I realized that I had forgotten a lot of the skills that I learned growing up because I just don't have the tools or opportunity to practice it. But I do love it. And someday when I'm rich and famous and comfortable, I will have a woodworking shop in my garage.
Yeah, that's something I aspire to do. I never did it before, but it's just something I aspire to get good at eventually. So I've always wanted to build guitars, like electric guitars.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I've got one hanging up right here.
Yeah.
In front of me.
Well, that's a completely different skill set from the more, shaker type Amish woodworking
Right,
that
right.
I grew up with. Yeah.
So maybe we'll have to have you back on because I think that the Amish part of it's so interesting too, and especially in contrast with the Islamic part of it's like they're so bizarrely similar in so many ways and yet diametrically opposed to each other
Yes.
at the same
yes.
time. It's fascinating. So that'll be a teaser for the next time I have you on for our
Looking forward
listeners.
to
But let's move on from Islam and you to the heartland of Islam, the Middle
Yes.
East and North Africa, and I
Yes.
guess to some degree Central Asia. But really the Arab. So let me actually start with this. So you really consider yourself to be an expert on the Middle East. I think it's fair to call yourself that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think based on your education and your personal experience, you do have quite a bit of expertise. Do you consider the Middle East just the Arabic kind of cultural sphere? Is it Middle East, North Africa, or would you also kind of include like Iran and maybe like Azerbaijan and Turkey into that circle, that sphere?
On the question of expertise, I self-describe as a specialist rather than an expert.
Excuse me, specialist.
And that is an exercise in intellectual humility on my part. I also grew up as a nerdy know-it-all, and I found that I was perpetually unaware of what I didn't know, and so I've grown to be wary of the term expert, unless someone has a genuine decades-long narrow specialty, right? And that's kind of an ethical commitment of mine that we can get into if we want to. But
no, I
anyway.
think it's not necessary. I actually agree
Yeah.
with you. I'll just add that I think that's why you and I are both voracious readers. I read because I enjoy it, but I also read it because I'm insecure and self-conscious about how much I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah. Same.
I'm
Yeah,
reading a
same.
book on the history of finance right now, and I'm like, I just realized like I don't know anything about this at all, so I have to read a
Yeah.
book about it.
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah. I'm doing the same thing with fucking naval strategy, right? I just got a book on naval strategy because I don't know shit about it. So, yes, I have been studying, reading either in an official capacity or in a self-guided capacity in between enrollments in school because I was in Georgia State University right after I got back from the Middle East about 15 years ago, and then I had a professional break. Anyway, for about a decade and a half, I have been elbows deep in the Middle East and in political violence. The Middle East as a term is very interesting. It originates from I'm going to put my postmodern neo-Marxist hat on and say it originates from empire and colonialism. It was the designation that the British Empire gave to a region in which it had colonial interests, and that the American military inherited from the British. So CENTCOM decides what the Middle East is and what it isn't, in a technical way. The region in which I specialized is the African and Asian Islamic lands, right? So North Africa from Morocco across to Egypt and then into the Sahel, the core Middle East that we think of, the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant with Iraq, and then Iran. Within that, what I am most capable of talking about and commenting on are the relationships between Iran and Saudi Arabia, with more focus on Saudi Arabia than on Iran. So that's where I'm, if you want to say that I have any genuine expertise, is going to be on the political dynamics between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and then its regional implications outside.
Okay, so let's get right into that because obviously there has been a lot going on in Iran recently.
Yes.
I was kind of brushing up on it today. It's something I've been paying attention to pretty closely as I can. And the numbers of protesters that have been killed have ranged from 5,000 to something a little over 36,000.
Yes.
There are reports that tens of thousands of people could have been massacred by the IRGC within like a 48-hour period in January,
which makes it potentially the deadliest conflict-induced mass casualty event since the bombing of Hiroshima.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, these numbers are speculative to a large degree. We really don't know if it's closer to 5,000 or closer to 40,000. My hunch is that the higher estimates are far more likely to be true than I am okay with, obviously. Not that 5,000 would be all that great, but it is very concerning. And so wrapped up in this protest movement is so much history. And like we alluded to before, Iran is actually, I will before I get into this, let me throw out some other numbers here. I have also been reading that the number of people, the percentage of the Iranian population that identifies as Shia Muslim. So it's important to note, and of course, Alex will correct me if I get anything wrong here, but it's important to note that Iran is a majority, or at least claims to be a majority Shia Muslim power, as opposed to the Sunni Muslims, which dominate the Arabic world, basically, like Egypt, Iraq, the Levant, Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa. They're majority Sunni. There are pockets of Shia. I think Hezbollah, correct me if I'm wrong, is technically a Shia organization. And so we don't have to get necessarily into the difference between Shia and Sunni. You all can look that up. It has to do with the Prophet Muhammad and his lineage and who's the correct leaders of Islam. Ancient political beef, right? The important thing to know is that there is beef, to put it in a layman's terms, right, between Sunnis and Shias. There has been for a long time. And that Iran is a Shia, claims to be a Shia power. I am seeing numbers like 30 to 35% of Iran are actually adherents to Shia Islam. That number used to be a little bit higher in previous decades after the regime took over, but that potentially because of the oppressive nature of the regime, a lot of people have become disillusioned, and that number has gone down and is now in the low to mid 30s. That there are a lot more what you would call nons, meaning people who are non-religious or atheists or agnostics. That number has gone up a little or quite a bit. That there is a small number of Sunnis. This, I think, largely has to do with the fact that there are actually Arabs within the borders of Iran. Persians are the majority ethnicity of Iran. However, they are not the only ethnicity of Iran. There are Azerbaijanis I should say Azeris, I think is the technical term for the ethnic group. You have, I think there's a few Kurds, there's some Arabs, there's other ethnic groups which might identify differently. So you have a Persian-dominated but still very ethnically diverse country that is Shia Islam seems to be still the largest single religious identifier, but is outweighed by all of the others combined. That's what I'm seeing. That's what I'm reading reports of. So, and also this goes to the thing we were talking about earlier, which is the fact that Iran has a pre-Muslim identity in a way that other countries don't. Other Muslim countries don't. Whereas Islam went into the Levant and North Africa and sort of completely displaced other identities and consumed them and pushed them out. Other ethnic religious identities. In Iran, you had Islam, and then you still had the idea of being Persian, right? Because you have one of the oldest continuous cultures in human history is the Persian identity. So you can't just wipe that out. It's a lot harder to do. And so you have this situation in Iran right now where people are protesting against the regime and they have this other ethnic identity to fall back on. They're not erasing themselves in a sense by pushing back against an Islamic theocracy. And I'm sorry for rambling. I don't mean to hog the mic, Alex. I'll just mention one more thing, which is this is super important relative to what you are a specialist in, which is the relationship specifically between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because Saudi Arabia is one of the other major power players in that region. It really is. Saudi Arabia, Iran, I think you could argue Turkey are the kind of the three most militarily powerful, economically powerful.
Israel.
And Israel. I'm thinking in terms of Muslim countries specifically.
Right,
Israel is kind of there's an asterisk there, right?
Yes.
But Israel is by far the most military
as a
capable.
regional actor.
As a regional actor, certainly. But in terms of a Muslim power in the Middle East, it's really those three. And Saudi Arabia is, I think, quite anxious about an Iran that is more powerful. I have to imagine they're also thinking maybe this is an opportunity if the regime falls and it becomes a more secular nation. Maybe we can do business with them more easily. That maybe allows us to have greater influence on Muslims, because Iran is no longer a Muslim country in any kind of majority sense or political sense. There's all these things that must be going through their heads, and that's really important to understand, because that is going to affect the politics of the Middle East greatly. I mean, it's hard to actually underestimate that. So I said a lot there, and I want to come in and let's kind of start from square one, which is, Alex, what really is going on in Iran right now? People are protesting. Why are they protesting? And what has happened since the protests began a few months ago?
So the way that I tell the story of the protests that are happening right now stretches back to 2018, 2019, and a series of protests that erupted then. It's really easy because of the 24-hour news cycle. Things enter and exit public consciousness. And to be honest, a lot has happened in America since 2019.
You don't
So
say.
there's good reason for people to really not have been paying attention to a country on the other side of the world from us. But there has been a building movement that begins with, ironically, hardliners. Protesting the regime's policies toward the Middle East in 2018, towards the United States in 2018, 2019. And it begins in very narrow pockets in high population areas in Tehran. And then it spreads outward. In 2022, we had the women life freedom movement, right? Which was the first interjection of the dysfunction in Iran into recent public consciousness in the West, particularly because it was surrounding these politically salient beliefs that we have here: feminism, the hijab, repression, things like that. And then now what we've seen is an unprecedented mobilization of people across the entire nation, in all 31 provinces of the country. In small towns, people were mobilizing and rising up. So there's really, truly something extraordinary happening right now that the Iranian regime has not faced since it came to power in 1970.
And these protests started as economic. I mean, it started with merchants. Am I not correct in terms of the most recent bout? Because you had this crazy devaluation of Iranian currency. But obviously it seems to have turned into something else. So how exactly did that happen in your view?
So the important thing to understand about that is that the bazaars have been a very important cultural institution in Iranian politics, preceding this regime, going all the way back to the Qajari era in the 19th century. So merchants, and for lack of a better term in English, the merchant guilds have had disproportionate political sway. So there's a long tradition of protests against the regime, beginning with merchants. And it doesn't always come from economics, but it often does. And that was the story for the recent eruption of protests. It is against economic dysfunction, rampant and open corruption that is now visible to the Iranian people through social media, which is why the government is so desperate to shut down the internet. All of these things are driving this anger. They're combining with a public consciousness that is westernized enough. And when I say westernized, we can get into what I mean. I'm talking about
Yeah.
something very specific.
Yeah, we're gonna that whole
Um,
concept of what constitutes West,
yeah.
the West, Westernness. We're gonna talk.
Yes.
We're saving that for later.
Sure.
Stay tuned.
Um, they're westernized enough that they feel the need for self-expression within their own government. Um, their government is acting against their economic interests and the interests that are salient to them. And so they are rebelling. Something is very important that I want to insert here is that, we talked about algorithmic capture and audience capture earlier. One problem that we have in the West, especially among Western liberals, is that we have the tendency to interpret this as a drive kind of like ours for liberalization. And we have social media algorithms that feed us that information. But it's important to remember, like you were alluding to earlier, that Iran is a plural society with many different factions. And there are westernized liberals and there are also um, nationalists, right, that have no interest in this liberalization regime, all competing. And there are people who, for various reasons, sincere or otherwise, want the return of the Shah's regime. And there
Yes.
are people who want something completely separate, right? So this is a plural movement that has converged into a coalition on these issues of economics, corruption, and control over their own government.
Yeah, so that is an extremely important point, right? There are a lot of very liberal westernized people in Iran. I actually think there's a more than we think, than most
Yes.
people would assume, right?
Yes.
There are also all kinds of other factions. There's ethnic factions and people with more ethnically based interests. Again, Persia has this very old, ancient, proud history. There are a lot of people who are more pro-Persian, pro like Iran than they are maybe pro-liberal. And of course, we've seen it seems, at least based on what I've seen on social media and news reporting, that there is a call for the return of, and why can I not think of his first name? Heir to the Pahlavi dynasty.
Yeah, Reza Shah Pahlavi. Yeah.
Yes, Reza Pahlavi. Yeah. And so that's very interesting, I think, for Westerner, because it's like, okay, you're trading a theocracy for a monarchy. But then you might think, at least what goes through my head is, okay, they might be calling for a constitutional monarchy. Maybe in a lot of protesters' heads, they're thinking like the UK, right? And it's important to note that not enough time to get into the history of the fall of the Shah and the rise of the Islamic Revolution. There's great podcasts that you can listen to about that and great books, but it is worth noting that the Shah, Muhammad Pahlavi, if I'm remembering his first name correctly, when he lost power, he had a bad reputation for being illiberal in many ways. I mean, he had a ruthless police force doing very horrible things. And so there was very legitimate anger against the Shah. And this created, and among liberals at the time, right? So you had this weird coalition where, like, at the time, they were much more popular. Marxists and leftists were buddying up with the Islamists to overthrow the Shah, and they kind of got duped, but that's a story for another day.
I want to interject
go for
here
it.
just to add an asterisk and say, yes, you are correct. And also, Muhammad Pahlavi was in the middle of a sweeping liberalization regime, reforms, which actually contributed to his downfall.
Yes.
Because in order to liberalize, he has to weaken his own regime, right?
Right.
And it was the weakening of his own regime in pursuit of this liberalization that creates the opportunity for the revolution. And that's relevant to something we're going to talk about with this regime a little bit later.
Also, he probably should have killed Khomeini before he went to Paris, but they had the opportunity. Again, we don't have time to get into the history, but literally, like, they had him under house arrest in like a nice place, and his like head of intelligence, if I'm getting that right,
I want to plug a book
interviewing him, and instead of just like, we should have just iced this guy, like he was obviously a problem. But anyway, plug a book, please. So
I want to plug a book.
Info.
The late and great international relations scholar Robert Jervis, who was coincidentally my first professor at Columbia in international relations before he died.
Wow.
Wrote a book called Why Intelligence Fails. And it is a compendium of his postmortems on intelligence failures surrounding the 1979 revolution in Iran, and also intelligence failures surrounding 9/11. Um, Brilliant book on the bureaucratic process of intelligence with historical insight into what happened in 1979 with the Shah. I recommend it to anybody who's interested in Iran and the current Iranian regime.
Okay, we'll definitely, again, have that in the comments. But let's get back on track here. So I was trying to do my best to provide a lot of context. It's hard to do because it's hard to know where to stop because there's so much, right?
There is, yeah.
But you have protesters protesting this regime, which has been around for decades. Really not that long, though. I think it's important to remember, like you said, they came to power in 1979. So it has been well under a century that the regime has actually been in power.
Yes.
They're protesting that. A lot of them seem to be calling for a return of the Pahlavis, even though Mohammed Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran, was very unpopular among the Iranian people, in part because among certain sectors because he was liberalizing, right?
Mm-hmm.
The more religious sects didn't like that, but also among the more liberal sectors because he was being oppressive, much more oppressive than he should have been in order to call himself a liberal leader, right? So he's a bit of a quagmire. So why do you think this Reza Pahlavi is now becoming a sort of a figure of resistance, and why is he being called upon by so many?
In order to overthrow a government, you must have alternative institutions ready to take on the governing role. That is something that the current Iranian regime has been really good at destroying within their borders. Reza Shah Pahlavi represents the only alternative currently available. He doesn't necessarily represent a good homegrown alternative. But when you are a people desperate for change, sometimes any change will do. And so that is one story about why we see some of these videos coming out where people are holding signs or chanting for the return of the Pahlavi regime. The other story that is important is that some but not all of these videos were AI generated. And I was just listening to War on the Rocks podcast, which is a great conflict analysis podcast by if you are able to appreciate, institutional perspectives. These are like uh, uh, quote unquote deep state foreign policy wonks that are plugged in to policy making, and they run the War on the Rocks podcast. They were talking about how there is some speculation among Iran watchers that some of these videos were actually produced by the Iranian regime in order to try and discredit the liberal or liberatory credentials of the protesters, right? To try and imply that they don't actually want freedom. They're asking for a monarchy to come back. And so the waters around the potential of Reza Shah Pahlavi and the salience of Reza Shah Pahlavi inside of Iran are too muddied for clear analysis.
Wow. Okay.
So it's one of those things that you got to put on the table and watch, but you have to let it mature. It's not ripe enough for good, strong analysis. I want to let it sit there and let it be something that we watch to see what happens with.
Speaking of things that are difficult to analyze, I'm going to ask you a dumb question, and it's a dumb question because I know you can't really give me a good answer. How likely do you think are these protests to actually bring about regime change in this in Iran? And actually, let me be specific and say, how likely do you think they are to do so without American intervention or Israeli intervention? And how likely are they to do so with, I'll let you interpret this how you will, relatively significant Israeli and American intervention? By significant, I mean kinetic, let's say.
Yeah, kinetic. Good question. Okay. So I want to start with, I anticipated this, and so I went and I pulled up a paper that I knew I was going to have to reference. A scholar called Yuri Zhukov went through and pulled data from 71 different high conflict civil wars and disaggregated it to do an analysis. I can send you a link to the paper if you no longer have institutional access through Columbia. I don't know how that works for alumni, but
I would love to be able to link it in the show notes. We'll see if I can do that.
Yeah, I have a PDF. I can send it to you. I don't. Yeah. What he argues, the summary of the argument is in the title of the paper, is that repression works, but not in moderation. And he argues that different conflict theaters have threshold of violence that if you exceed, you will succeed in suppressing any sort of resistance against the regime. The thresholds vary from theater to theater, and he lays out complicated regression models with different variables that he uses to describe. And there's all kinds of graphs and stuff for the nerds that are interested in the statistics of it. What he argues is that regimes that are both able and willing to use extraordinary and extreme violence against their own population will likely succeed in protecting themselves from regime change. That's what the data shows us. But expanding from his argument, we can also say that given what we know about the way that political psychology and mass psychology works, regimes that survive this way are on borrowed. They can survive for a long time. Bashar al-Assad did this in 2012, and we all thought that he had just signed his death warrant. But that warrant waited another decade, almost a decade and a half, before it was executed, right? And now he's living in some apartment somewhere in Moscow.
Yeah, which Tucker Carlson has told me is a really lovely place. So it worked out well for him.
According
Yeah.
to Tucker, yes. I'm sure he would think so. And so it's through that lens that we have to look at what just happened in Iran. What happened in Iran was a nationwide uprising that most regimes cannot survive, either because they do not have the willingness to turn their guns against their own people, or they do not have the capacity to do so. Iran has shown us that they have. So now that that has happened and 30,000 people have died I'll talk about numbers later, but I'll use 30,000 as a placeholder for now.
Right.
I don't actually think that that's a reliable number, but we can get into that if we want.
Right. Certainly many thousands.
Many thousands of people, even by the most conservative estimates, have died in an incident of mass political violence. I think that for now, the capacity of the organizers of this movement to actually continue to pose a threat to the regime has been significantly degraded. We also have to keep in mind that as we speak, the protests have mostly died down. People have gone home to, quote unquote, lick their wounds, as one analyst put it. The secret police are active, finding the people who organized this, who played any significant role in this. People are still dying. They're being taken out behind the shed and shot, right? So the death toll is continuing to climb as the IRGC does its dirty. The regime has the potential to survive for another decade. This incident does not imply that it will die now, but it does imply that it is dying. It is a sick and diseased regime that will eventually die of this, either biologically with the death of Ali Khamenei, the current Ayatollah, or organically later on as these resistances come back.
And so, to the second part of my question, let me rephrase it a little bit. Do you think that if and I wouldn't put it past him based on recent events, right? If Trump was just like, excuse my French, I don't know why I said that. We curse on this podcast all the time. If Trump's like, fuck these guys, and decides to bomb, the various headquarters and bases for the police and military forces, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, so on and so forth, like bombs their supply depots, various things of that nature, maybe even sends in, with the help of Israel, some, conducts an assassination effort to take out many of the leaders of the regime, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that makes a big difference? Do you think either we can scare the regime into running to Moscow or some other, probably not Moscow, but running into some, other place to go into hiding, or at least take out enough of scare enough of the foot soldiers to affect their willingness to commit these kinds of murders enough so that these protesters relatively soon could succeed?
It's a possibility. Yeah, it's a possibility. One thing that I would have to stress when we think about an operation like this is that uh, regimes like the Iranian regime are incredibly resistant to decapitation. So we'll have a situation like we have in Venezuela, where the Maduro regime is still standing and still governing the country. Chavismo is alive and well, even though Nicolas Maduro himself was destroyed, uh, removed from the equation. So such an operation would have to be of the sort that you're describing, persistent, wide scale strikes. What political violence at that scale is capable of doing is destroying the capacity of a political organization to act. Political violence cannot build new capacity. That's one of the incredible insights from Hannah Arendt's tiny book, less than 100 pages, on violence. It's called On Violence by Hannah Arendt. She's a 20th century political philosopher that is very relevant to our time. Political violence can never build capacity, it can only destroy it. And so when we're looking to political violence to alter the outcomes of a specific political situation, what we're looking to do is degrade the regime's capacity to do anything when someone else is willing to build something in its stead, right? So what would need to happen is the United States or Israel would have to conduct this large operation, degrade the regime's capacity to suppress new political movements within its own country. And then those new political movements are going to have to organize in such a way that they can replace what is lost. Right now, they don't have that, but they might get it.
I was going to say, it sounds like a tall order. I think that's a very difficult thing to do.
It's a tall order. If there were any culture in the world that I would be optimistic about their capacity to do it, Iranians would be at the top, would be one of the top. Similar to high identity salience political cultures in the West. The Iranian people know a lot about building new governments. They've done it a few times.
Right.
That said, what I'm worried about with such an intervention is the legitimacy of whatever comes after the current regime. Like we said, Iran is a plural society, so legitimacy can't really rest on commitments to certain ideals like liberal ideals. Legitimacy would have to come from capable governance, and it would have to come from congruence with Iranian national identity to begin with. And Iranian national identity is something that I argue is particularly sensitive to foreign intervention. And so there's going to be this tension here of how does a government that builds itself on the aftermath of a foreign intervention justify itself to a national people who are particularly sensitive to that foreign intervention, and for whom one of the primary drivers of any legitimacy is going to be the capacity to resist foreign pressures. So there's a fundamental tension there that does not necessarily carry me through to the argument that one must not intervene, but it will carry me to the argument that if one does intervene, you have to have a serious strategic plan that takes this into account.
Yeah.
And that's what I see is missing from our current conversation, is a serious strategic long-term plan for the role that Iran will play.
Well, for the sake of time, I would ask you about what you think that is, but I do want to move on to slightly different things. I will add briefly, though, I will maybe super quickly discuss that I kind of have this notion of there's such a large Iranian diaspora, right? I don't know. I mispronounced that word. I did it in another podcast. I don't know why I say like diaspora, an Iranian diaspora. Particularly in like Western countries. I mean, like the US, the EU, and the UK. And I have some friends who are part of that diaspora, sort of all over the world, and I see them posting about this, and they're so adamant that like this is Iran standing up for themselves, like this is my people fighting for their freedom, and I very much empathize with that, and I agree with it. And I'm wondering, is it possible to get a coalition, a sort of diaspora like force, not force in the military sense, to once let's say the regime is toppled, with the help of some foreign powers, say the United States, for that diaspora to go in and help do the work of helping them build liberal institutions, because many of these people are educated in Western institutions who understand liberalism, who understand democracy. It should be said that many Iranians on the ground in Iran also understand this, but they would get an influx of other Iranians who understand this, and kind of increase the percentage of Iranians who value these things and understand how to do them. And perhaps this group is spearheaded by the would-be Shah of Reza Pahlavi. Is that realistic? This is just a thought I have. Do you think that is plausible?
Sure.
That you could get hundreds of thousands potentially of, maybe not even that much, but like tens to hundreds of thousands of diaspora members to go back to Iran on a project of nation rebuilding?
Nation building, yes. Absolutely, it's possible. And in fact, I think it is to some degree inevitable that it will happen if the current regime falls. The question becomes, what happens with them next? Do they represent an authoritative voice among the people that they return to, or do they become another faction within an arena of competing factions for influence? I think a wonderful recent example of something like this happening is the return of migrants and refugees to Syria after the fall of Bashar al-Assad. We had a diaspora of people that had been living in the West for a long time, 15 years, 10 years, some of them 20 years, who fled the regime before the civil war began, returning to Syria with a lot of energy and hope for building a new liberal regime. And the success there has been mixed, but to the point it has been successful, it's been remarkable, especially given the background of the now president, Ahmed al-Sharaa.
Yeah, he's got a sketchy background, to put it mildly.
Put it very mildly, right? And so the success of state building in Syria has been something that's remarkable to watch. It's by no means done or even wholly successful. There are some major problems that I'm anticipating will get worse in the future. But to the extent that it has happened now, it's remarkable, and I think it is in part explained by the return of diaspora to the country. So that's something completely feasible that could happen with Iran. The question is just, to what extent are they going to be able to find their political footing once they come back and organize?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that gives me a little bit of optimism, cautious optimism, but optimism nonetheless. Iran, I'm not the only person to say this. This isn't an original idea per se or outlook, but I really do think the world loses out on an Iran that is oppressed, because it is such a vibrant and deep culture. It goes so deep in human history, and and the Iranians more than anyone else loses out, but the rest of us do too. I mean, that is a culture and a nation that has the potential to do so much good for themselves and the world, and it is just being kneecapped by an oppressive theocracy.
Yeah, I agree. The potential for artistic, literary, poetic expression is deep and profound there. Persian poetry is some of the most beautiful writing you will find in the world, and I think we need more of it.
And as a diehard Yimby bro, I have to say their bricklayers are, I mean, chef's kiss. When you look at Iranian brickwork,
have you seen their tile work?
Oh my God, I want that in American cities. Like, bring them over here and have them build things. It's incredible. I also want to, I want to sort of jump across the Persian Gulf to Saudi Arabia.
Sure.
What are the Saudis thinking, and what do you think that they are thinking? What's going on in their heads, and what are they thinking in terms of how they're going to approach this if the regime falls, and if it doesn't fall, and like we talked about a little, like alluded to earlier, they have this I think at least they could be seeing this as both a threat and an opportunity.
Yes.
So expand on that.
Yeah. So I can think of three important things that Saudi strategists are going to be putting on their table. First, is going to be the fundamental reorganization of power in the region. A new regional hegemon has established military dominance, and that's Israel, at the expense of Iran. Iran militarily is incredibly degraded and really just does not pose the same threat to Saudi Arabia that it posed a year ago after the 12-day war. That said, Chinese interests are dominant in the region. Chinese influence in Iran and Saudi Arabia are far greater than we in the West are currently aware of. One of the big drivers of this is going to be just energy geopolitics. China, in planning for a potential conflict with the United States, needs a channel through which it can pump oil as an alternative to the Malacca Strait.
Right.
And
because we could, for the listeners, because we could block that off very easily. Us and our allies could cut them off from energy supplies, which would be devastating.
We have enough naval dominance that we can seal the Malacca Strait and suffocate the incredibly oil hungry China.
Right. And I'll just say for your sake, Alex, since you're reading this naval strategy book, I'm certainly no expert. I'll caveat with that, but I think the Chinese Navy is wildly overrated.
Overhyped.
Yeah, they just have no their expeditionary capability is like zero, basically. They're really, really powerful within a short range of their own shores.
Right. They have littoral dominance.
Right. And so if they had to try and use naval power to open up that stopgap through the Strait of Malacca, they just have no chance, I think.
They cannot.
Yeah.
Right. So you would be interested, since you're thinking about geopolitical strategy, you'll be interested to know that China has completed the second to final leg of a pipeline network through central Iran down to the Persian Gulf. There is one segment running from the northeast corner of Iran to finally connect with a pipeline network along the coast that could supply oil across Central Asia through Afghanistan. They have been working on this since we left Afghanistan, and they have been incredibly energetic in that. And so Chinese interests in Iran are crucial. They want a stable Iran so they don't have to worry about security for that pipeline. They have cultivated enough influence with the government of Iran and with the government of Saudi Arabia that they have been able to force a rapprochement even before the 12-day war. That's a significant achievement. So Chinese influence is going to be a dominant factor in Saudi thinking. The third is the security arrangement that they're developing with Pakistan. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but Saudi Arabia just signed a mutual defense pact with Pakistan. And there's been talk about whether or not Turkey will involve themselves in that mutual defense pact as well. Saudi Arabia is trying to diversify its security sponsors away from the United States because it views the United States as an unreliable security sponsor in light of recent events. So we're looking at a regional player that wants to survive, is deeply pragmatic, has a long history of pragmatism within the royal family, has recently undergone a major internal transition, and is trying to balance Chinese influence, its own security interests, and a major shift in regional power. So yeah, I think that we're looking at a nation that sees an opportunity and a risk, and they're going to play their cards very carefully and conservatively, I think, for now, until the situation in Iran actually clears up and they can get a clearer strategic vision.
Interesting. I mean, just I feel like I say interesting so much. I need to find a new word. It's fascinating. And so much of this is just so up in the air that it is, of course, horrible. I should very much emphasize that. I mean, what the Iranian people are going through is just atrocious. But from a nerd for geopolitics, it is like I need to get some popcorn. I mean, it's just so interesting.
We live in interesting
we are
times.
very much cursed to live in interesting times.
Yes.
Unless you find it weirdly entertaining. I guess it's not that weird, but unless you find it entertaining like we do, and then it is both mortifying, but also like you can't look away. It's like a car crash.
I have job security.
You have job security, yeah.
Yeah.
Good for the podcast. But I mean, I think I can speak for both of us when I say I would love nothing more than to see Iran become the liberal, economically prosperous nation that I think it absolutely has has everything it needs to be, should be, and has every right to be. So I think it's a good note to end on before we transition into a slightly different topic. I'm sure some of this will come up again because it is obviously what you focus on in to a large degree. And I want to shift to what you've been writing about on your Substack. Substack will be linked I highly recommend you all go and check it out. Alex is a great writer and a very what's the word I want to use? I want to use a very specific word. A very deep thinker. You make connections to things. You connect different ideas and events and concepts, which I guess is just ideas in it's just a synonym for ideas. Struggling with my words here. It's good. You should read his Substack. It's good.
Thank you.
What
Isaiah Berlin once said that it is infinitely more pleasurable to receive more than one's due than to receive one's due. And you've given me more than one's due, so thank you.
I like to be a hype man for my guests. You take the time to come on the podcast. At least I could do is hype you up. But it's not unearned, because I really do think your Substack is worth reading. Not a lot of people are reading it right now. I hope you don't mind me saying, and that is a crime.
Yeah. I just started it this month.
I want that to change. So, in your own words, what is your project with that Substack?
Yeah, I'm working on a very long intellectual project. By long, I mean probably a decade or more, talking about a philosophy of political violence in the 21st century. And what that involves is developing a strong concept of political peoplehood, because political peoplehood is the thing that violence does its work on. And so what I'm doing is taking tidbits of my thought, my ideas for this large project, and writing them out in small essays commenting on current events. So I'm talking a bit about what I view as a return to the need to talk about nuclear violence. I'm talking a bit about the way that we culturally process violence within our own societies. I wrote an essay on the assassination of Charlie Kirk and the ways in which we as a people have reacted to that. And what I want to do, what I'm going to try to do in my next essay, is to try and sketch out a version of citizenship, a concept of membership in a political whole that I think is going to be capable of resisting the stress of increasing political violence as we move further into the 21st century. So that's in broad what my project is about. And subsets of that project are going to be political culture. So I talk a lot about political culture and identity. It's going to be about religion. It's going to be about violence as a phenomenon in itself, and then violence as it relates to our whole political psychology.
So obviously, like you said, it's a big topic.
It's a massive
with lots of individual parts. And this is what I mean by you are good at connecting things, because you connect current events with recent events, with philosophical and political concepts to sort of draw out this theory in a very nuanced and detailed way. One a good example is the Charlie Kirk essay that you wrote, which, you made this call to action really in that essay that I very much agree with. And that is, you want people to see both Charlie Kirk and his murderer as one of us and not the other. And we see Charlie Kirk, like if you're on the left, let's say, you see Charlie Kirk as this horrible monster Though I will say, even though I disagree with him on so many things, I actually agree with Ezra Klein's take that he was practicing politics the right way. I think you push back against that a little bit.
I do, yeah.
But I think fundamentally, even though you point to his admittedly sometimes underhanded tactics about how he chooses to edit his videos and whatnot, he is talking to people and not punching them. And that at base is the single most by far important thing about how one practices politics. I agree with many of your criticisms, do not get me wrong, but I think really at this stage in the game, we should be just putting lavish praise upon anyone who says it's about talking, it's about debating.
Sam Harris.
Sam Harris. I mean, it's a great example. We're just going to name this episode the Sam Harris Fan Club Hour.
Right.
No, but I think that call to action of seeing Kirk and his murderer simultaneously as one of us, and not Kirk is this horrible right-wing bigot and his murderer is some crazy trans, left Marxist or whatever. They are Americans. They are part of our civilization and our people. That is crucial. And so why do you make that call to action?
I'm going to ask for a little philosophical indulgence here, going to a little bit of the history of ideas from your audience.
Go for it.
In the 20th century, there's a political philosopher named Carl Schmitt, and he starts thinking about what politics is at its base. And he starts from the idea of how we divide up land and territory, and he carries it through a series of logical conclusions. And what he lands on is this idea that politics, fundamentally, is the differentiation between friends and enemies. It is the dividing of peoples into us and them, and then justifying violence against them in order to preserve the us. He advocates for this as a sort of realist conception of politics. His framing of politics becomes the philosophical engine of the fascist movements. In Nazi Germany, he was himself a Nazi.
Shocker.
Along with Martin Heidegger.
Yeah.
And what is happening in our current age on both the left and the right in different languages and different permutations is we are seeing a rise of Schmittian politics, to the point that Carl Schmitt himself is increasing in academic citations as we speak in the last 10 years. People are reading him again, and they are following his logics into the politics of friends and enemies. The problem with the politics of friends and enemies is that it is antithetical to a politics of solidarity among a national people, because nations are imagined constructs. I'll plug another book, Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson. He's a Marxist historian. The Marxists got a lot wrong, but they're great at turning out materialist historians. And it's one of the best explorations of the origins of nationalism, which is very relevant here. A nation is a community of people that are all different fundamentally. We're not the same people. We tend to speak the same language, and we tend to read the same print sources, right? The same literary culture.
Right.
But we are different. We're not the same. But we imagine ourselves to be connected by this thing called national identity across our differences. When you inject Schmittian politics of friends and enemies into that, it fractures. What is happening with Charlie Kirk is the end point of Schmittian politics. It is the justification of murder and the divide between us and them within a national body. And my call is to reject Schmittian politics in the way that Thomas Mann did, who I cited in the essay that I wrote, when he called Hitler his brother while he was in exile hiding from the Third Reich, right?
It's worth pointing out that, neither of us are big Charlie Kirk fans per se, but
personally despise.
Yeah, he's not Hitler. And so
No.
if one can do this with Hitler, certainly one can do it with Charlie Kirk.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the thought process that I'm trying to encourage people to begin to adopt is to see Charlie Kirk as one of the various manifestations that it is possible for our own cultural values to take, right? So we value things like victory in debate, right? That is a social good that we as a culture value. And one of the versions of that is the kind of sophistry that I argue Charlie Kirk embodies. Thomas Mann argues that one of the core values of German culture in the middle of the 20th century was genius. And they must tolerate the fact that Hitler himself is a kind of genius. And so we are all plugged into the cultural engine that generates people like Charlie Kirk and people like his killer. We value self-expression, right? And so the debate around gender emerges from this universal cultural value of self-expression. We are all connected to that in some way, and that gives us a cultural brotherhood that I think surpasses the Schmittian politics of friends and enemies.
So because we're running short on time, we're at an hour and a half, I won't dive into that too much, but I do think that is a great summation of your project, and it at least would hook me if I was listening. So, but you mentioned something that I think is a good, creates a good segue opportunity into the other thing I want to talk about that we've been teasing before, which is, and I think is obviously very related, which is friends and enemies. We're all connected by this universal kind of culture, which, as we alluded to earlier in the conversation, is in a sense a Christian culture, a Western culture that has specific cultural markers, like a value of self-expression. I would argue a sort of reverence of victimhood, getting that from Tom Holland's book, and that sort of goes back to Christianity and Christ as the sacrificial figure. We were talking on the phone a couple days ago before this podcast. I brought up a book you hadn't read yet, which you have to read, which is The Weirdest People in the World, by
it is sitting right next to me.
Great.
Yeah.
Which will again also be in the comments or in the show notes. Which makes the argument that the West is psychologically unique in terms of its, and actually there's a lot of psychological research to substantiate this, and he brings this up in the book. The author is Joseph Heinrich. It's either Heinrich or Henrik, I'm not really sure. In the sense that Westerners are more likely to value individualism, which kind of is related to that self-expression, right? Like we're more likely to be analytical thinkers, to kind of take things apart by their constituent parts, analyze each part, rather than seeing things as holistically as other cultures do, so on and so forth. There's a lot more to it. So I think I'll start off by saying I would argue that there really is something called the West, culturally, in terms of culturally, psychologically, institutionally, there is a West. However, as we just mentioned earlier, it is complicated because I think a lot of people would say that Islam and the Middle East are not part of the West. I would say, and we talked about this before on the phone. We didn't record it, unfortunately, that the answer is yes and no. Because I think the West we don't have enough vocabulary to describe two things that can count as a kind of thing that you could call the West. But we don't have enough vocabulary to distinguish those things. So there is the West in the sense that you would get from reading The Weirdest People in the World, Heinrich's book, which really is, generally speaking, northern Italy to the UK, the Scandinavian nations, maybe minus Finland, Germany, the Low Countries, France. That is like the core of the West, with like the Iberian Peninsula and Eastern Europe also having a certain amount of Westernness, or it's just like the Western Slavic peoples having a fair amount of Westernness in there. That kind of is the core. And then, of course, the colonial expansion of those places. So like the U.S., Canada, New Zealand, Australia, et cetera, et cetera. This is kind of like culturally and psychologically the most West of the West. But there is also a geographic and broader cultural definition, broader historical definition of what the West is in terms of peoples that have interacted and ideas that have been shared, that includes what I just talked about, this sort of psychologically and culturally extra special, extra unique West, but also, and I think you agree with me on this, I'm going to hand it off to you, also Islam, also the Muslim world, also, the Orthodox world, right? And we're using the same word for both of those sort of concentric circles, and really we need more vocabulary to be more specific. But make your argument, if you could, Alex. Why should one consider the Middle East and the Muslim world to be a part, or at least I should say the Muslim heartland? I think Indonesia is a very different case, right? But
It is, yes.
that particular Muslim heartland to be part of the West in some sense.
Yeah. So I can approach this from two angles. The first is, earlier we talked about culture and religious identity kind of overlapping heavily, even more heavily than specific beliefs. A core piece of the cultural psychology of Christendom, which I think no one would dispute is fundamental to this identity construct called the West that we're trying to draw lines around, is Platonic influence, right? Plato and the Platonic tradition is fundamental. And then Aristotle, especially through Thomas Aquinas, which is now seeing a revival, and of which I'm a part of the Neo-Aristotelian school. That's where I draw my values, my ethical frameworks from. These are foundational building blocks of what we call the West, and also foundational building blocks of Muslim thought. And so, regardless of how different or when we diverged, one might think, we have to face the reality that we share cultural DNA. It's undeniable that Aristotle is foundational for all of us. I think Aristotle's probably one of the most influential human beings to have ever existed. And then there is cultural interchange. One very interesting exercise that you could do is go look at treaties between the United Kingdom and the Ottoman Empire from the 14th century, and then compare them to treaties from the 16th century. And you will see that in between the two, something happened within the cultural psychology of the British that made them change the way that they viewed the Ottomans that they were interacting with. Prior to this shift, what you see is interactions between members of the same broad society that include France and the Prussian kingdoms at the time, or Italy, and an interaction between peoples in the Ottoman world and in the UK government, or at the time the Kingdom of England, which resembled the interactions that they had with peoples in France or in Italy or in Germany. And then there is this shift, this emergence of a new awareness of divergence between the two that happens around the Enlightenment, or around the early onset of the Enlightenment. So that's a fascinating exercise, to just go back and read diplomatic documents to see the way that these cultures interacted with each other, and you can trace the change. So if we want to conceptualize the West as something that inherits, say, Rome and Greece and Christianity out of Jerusalem, if that's the way that we want to imagine what this thing that we call the West is, then there is no difference between the Christian West and what we could call the Muslim West. The Muslim West inherited from Rome and Greece and Jerusalem just as much as the Christian world did. We find a divergence later in history around the advent of the Age of Exploration, the Enlightenment, this profound change that Europe begins to undergo. That is where we can find a divergence between the Muslim world and the Christian world. And it's not a complete divergence, because I'm going to argue in future essays that the Muslim world also underwent modernity at the same time, but it followed a different cultural track.
Wow. Okay. I'm looking forward to reading that, because that would be a new perspective for me, and I'm excited to see what you have to say about it. Everything that you're saying makes sense. So just to sort of summarize, the West in terms of like Europe, in terms of how people might think about it, and then the West, like the Muslim West, we'll say the Christian and the Muslim West, right? We use that vocabulary because I think it makes it relatively clear. Are both part of the West, but took different cultural and philosophical pathways, but drawing from the same source material. So those pathways, while divergent, aren't wildly far apart, and they have a lot of the same DNA.
Yes.
And so part of me wants to say that, like, going back to the issue of the vocabulary, a good word for what you might call the broader West or the Christian and Muslim West combined might be like the Abrahamic culture, the Abrahamic lens, because they draw from, or like you might say the Aristotelian or something like that, some reference to that DNA of like the Muslims draw from believe in the God of Abraham, as do the Jews, it should be said, as do the Christians.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the philosophy they get from Aristotle or from Plato goes through that lens, because the demands of faith, they get that we're all getting in the West, the broader West, this sort of Abrahamic superculture. We're all getting Aristotle and Plato, but we're getting it through the lens of the Christian tradition or the Muslim tradition. But those traditions go back to the God of Abraham.
Yeah. That's a really defensible framing. There's some asterisks that I would throw in there that we really don't have time to dive into, but I would say that I think this is correct, and I think that the criticisms that come from this thinker I'm going to reference don't fully land, but we have to account for criticisms that come from cosmopolitanism, like Kwame Anthony Appiah, whose lectures and work you can find online or YouTube. He's a political philosopher and a cultural critic who is a cosmopolitan, who argues that the West isn't a real thing, and he really emphasizes this interchange aspect with other societies. We're going to have to account for that. I think that his criticisms don't carry all the way through to where he takes them, but it's an exercise in intellectual honesty and integrity to go out there and grab the best of what he has to say, attacking the view that we're framing here, and incorporate it into our account of this thing that we're calling the West. And I don't have time to go into details, but yeah, it's a useful exercise.
Well, I'll link to him as well so people can kind of know that this is someone to look into who might push back against what we're saying. And speaking of time, we're almost at an hour 45, and I don't want to be too greedy with your Sunday. We're recording this on a Sunday. This was a phenomenally interesting and fascinating conversation, Alex. I really thank you so much for coming on. I will have to have you back on, because I also forgot to mention, going all the way back to your origin story, you were once a bounty hunter, weren't you? Or a private investigator?
I was a private investigator.
A PI. Yeah. So you were a
PI,
Muslim Amish PI who studied in Saudi Arabia, who's now studying at SIPA in New York.
Yes.
And there's a lot more to get into. There's a lot more about, I think, Islam and its relationship with, I guess, the Christian West, that I would love to dive in with you at a certain point. And inevitably, you're going to write more interesting articles that I'm going to want to talk about with you. So I'll have to have you back on. Thank you so much for coming on. And is there anything else you want to point people toward? Do you have like social media accounts or other things you're working on? Or
my Substack is my only outlet, and then, like I said, I've got such a workload with school right now that my Substack output is actually going to slow down. So I'll start putting out something every 2 weeks rather than once a week like I have been. But yeah, I'll be putting stuff up on Substack, and I look forward to talking again, man. This was great.
This was really fun. And if you find yourself really missing Alex's Substack, you can always read mine.
Yes.
Thanks a lot, everyone, and we'll catch you in the next one.
Bye.